Next we have Dr. David Nutt, who will cover the rest of the world.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye now.
Thanks. Let me see if this works. Okay, am I in your way? You can see the screen, can you? You sure? Okay, good. So I was asked to talk about international policies for psychedelics, and I explained to the organisers actually it wouldn't take very long. So could I fill the rest of the hour telling you what we've been doing and others have been doing in terms of the brain science? So they agreed kindly. But the logo here, by the way, it shows how the field has transformed in just a few years. That logo is the logo of the Bristol University Physiology and Pharmacology Society. That's a student logo for their society. And to my mind, that's remarkable evidence that we're winning the discussion, at least, for a student society to endorse what we're doing and come up with rather clever little pictures like that. There's genes and there's neurons. I don't know what the bones have got to do with Amanita, but anyway, that's another story. So we've already, Kerry touched on this a little in his talk, but the constraints that we have to deal with today are really within these two UN conventions, the 61 Convention on Plants and Fungi and the 71 Convention, Psychotropic Convention, which covers synthetics and pure extracts of those. And these conventions have two goals. They have the goal of preventing abuse, and the second goal is ensuring their availability for medical and scientific purposes. And I guess I don't need to tell this audience that they've failed on both in a very catastrophic way. And they failed because, I think, almost intentional ignoring or having a blinkered perspective on the benefits and a collection of misrepresentations of the harms. So it's common still today for me to talk to colleagues, scientists, pharmacologists, psychiatrists who say, well, these drugs are really dangerous, aren't they? These psychedelics are dangerous because they're addictive. I say, no, they're not addictive, and they've never been addictive. Well, they must be addictive because they wouldn't be in Schedule 1, would they? They're in Schedule 1 because, essentially, because Nixon and the American government wanted them in Schedule 1, and those days, the American government controlled the United Nations, and so basically the rest of the world complied with what the UN wanted. And it's also common for people to say, well, there is no medical value, and of course, there's huge medical value, and there was an enormous amount of medical value that was known before they were made illegal, but that was conveniently forgotten. And the third thing, and this is the thing that particularly exercises me in the charity that I work with, Drug Science, that it doesn't seem as though there was any consideration ever made to the lost opportunities. So the banning of these drugs was supposedly got something to do with reducing harms, although there weren't many harms, and it's not really obvious whether any benefits accrued in that direction. But the loss of opportunities for people with medical, psychiatric, neurological problems who would have benefited from these didn't seem to be part of the discussion at all. And of course, as I'll show you, the power of the ban has been so overwhelming that it's actually kind of fueled I'm going to say a virtuous circle, but it's very much a non-virtuous circle of ignorance which perpetuates the misunderstandings. So here is the impact that the 67 ban in the States and the 71 UN conventions had on psychedelic research. So the blue lines are the number of papers per year published with LSD, and then the pink one, the red one at the bottom, is psilocybin. And you can see a massive increase in research publications, peaking around about 1967, Why was that? That was because the US government, through the National Institutes of Health, which is way the biggest funder of biomedical research in the world, funded over 140 separate grants to study these compounds. And then the arrow shows when that stopped. You can see there are a couple of years where the data was being written up, because obviously it takes 2-3 years to get all your data out, and then the precipitate fall in publications. And by the way, I can just say to all of you, if any of you want, you can have all my slides. So have them afterwards. You know, you don't have to take pictures, just take them. There was, I believe, although it's not, I don't think it was ever written, but there were conversations going on, particularly in the CIA and the DEA and NIDA. There was a hope that you could get rid of all knowledge of psychedelics. If you didn't fund any research, people would forget that there ever was any value. And it got very close. You see, in 1990 and 1991, there was not a single paper in the world published on psilocybin. That catastrophic fall-off was caused by two main factors. The first was that after that red arrow, the US government, NIH, never funded another study. That's just been rectified, as you know, last November. Matt Johnson's study of psilocybin and tobacco smoking has been funded. So we've had a 55-year hiatus in funding from the biggest funder in the world. And the second reason is that even if you could get funding from, a donor or a philanthropist, you couldn't get the drug. And the DEA in the US and in my country, the MHRA, made it virtually impossible. The hoops you have to jump through to get hold of these drugs, to comply with the regulations are so, it's like being in a Kafka play. You don't know what the rules are, they don't know what the rules are, but one thing they do know is how to make sure you never know what the rules are, so you can never get them. And this is the worst censorship of research in the history of the world. It's the worst censorship of all research, not just medical research. It also applied to cannabis, by the way. You see on the top right, there was a massive increase in cannabis research when people understood that cannabis was a drug and there were cannabis receptors, etc. And again, that declined dramatically. But it came back a bit sooner, and it came back, of course, because of the decision of a whole number of American states to allow access to medical cannabis. But the psychedelics have lagged behind now. They're 20 years behind. And this is truly outrageous. And it's particularly outrageous because of the fact that psychedelics are some of the least harmful drugs known. This is now a very famous study we did comparing the harms of 20 different drugs on a very sophisticated 16-point scale of harms. And the blue bars are the harms of the drugs to the user, and the red bars are the harms of the drugs to society. And you can see that alcohol in the UK came out as top, and magic mushrooms came out as bottom, and LSD came down very low alongside mushrooms and ecstasy. Now that's been replicated by a group of European experts, 30 European experts from 20 countries. They changed every rating, they changed every weighting, and they came exactly the same results. The only difference was that GHB changed places with ketamine. And it was more recently been replicated in Australia in 2018. So we've got 3 Western groups of experts all coming to the same conclusions. And alcohol is always number 1, and magic mushrooms are always the lowest. The ban actually led to some extraordinary convoluted thinking. In Australia, they tried to ban planting native plants in people's gardens if they contained DMT. Now, I think a large proportion of the native plants in Australia contain DMT. So the idea that you'd actually ban your own flora from people's gardens just in case someone decided to actually access the DMT. I mean, it's hard to imagine, isn't it? I mean, it really, why would you care? And why would you actually want to bring in all these non-native species? It could actually destroy your ecology. And I don't know how many of you have read Michael Pollan's latest book, Your Mind on Plants. I mean, the first chapter is remarkable. The first chapter is a chapter he wrote about 30 years ago when he was writing for Harper's, about how he was visited by the DEA because he was growing ornamental poppies. And there was a genuine attempt to try to eliminate poppy growing, even though these poppies don't make very much in the way of opium. And it's a wonderful chapter because it kind of highlights the absolute absurdity of applying drug laws without any kind of thought to what their value is. But some escaped. Amanita, interestingly, escaped. Now, I guess that's because it doesn't grow much in America. Because, since you make the laws, if you don't know what it is. I have another view, actually. It's because that's what, of course, that's how Santa was invented, and Santa now is owned by Coke, and Coke really wouldn't want to be associated with the reality of the origins of the Santa Claus myth. Ibogaine, of course, in West Africa and elsewhere. And it's not generally known, but Ibogaine is a medicine in New Zealand. It's a licensed medicine. The only country in the world where I think it's a licensed medicine. And why is that? So I was in New Zealand a few years ago, and I asked a colleague of mine, who's a sort of head of addiction research in University of Christchurch, how come you guys are so ahead of the game? And he said, it was very easy, actually, because people were using it. They were using it down in the South Island to treat heroin addiction. And the health minister rang me up one day and said, Doug, is Ibogaine a good treatment for addiction? He said, sure. And so they made it legal. Yeah, absolutely. There's some interesting anomalies. Ireland didn't realise that 5-methoxy was psychoactive, so it actually was legal in Ireland until very recently. And of course, Mexico, I think the toad scrapings always were legal. And Switzerland, any Swiss people here? Switzerland, I guess because it was, that's where Hoffman lived, and that's where the sort of psychedelic renaissance began. They've allowed both psilocybin and LSD and now and MDMA for compassionate use, and they've got a very sophisticated program of that. And that's working quite well in the sense that they were the first LSD study in anxiety disorders recently reported as an add-on in this kind of compassionate use scheme. And I think Canada now there is some access in Canada and in theory Australia, but they're fighting a very hard battle in Australia, which we are fighting against, trying to block that, but I think we will eventually win. And then there are areas where we've seen hope. Of course, we've already heard in Carey's talk about the availability of peyote for Native American churches. In the UK, we had a very interesting story. We didn't ban magic mushrooms. Occasionally we stood up to the Americans. We allowed the prescription of heroin for pain, and we didn't ban magic mushrooms until 2005, when we got a man called David Cameron. I used to say he was the worst prime minister we've ever had, but he's been succeeded by even worse ones now. And when he was leader of the Tory opposition, he started to complain that the Labour Party was soft on drugs, and Tony Blair decided to ban magic mushrooms in about 2005. But up to that point, they were legal. Of course, the Netherlands were much smarter. The Netherlands, they actually banned the mushroom, but they didn't ban the truffle. And the Dutch have had access to psilocybin truffles forever. Sad thing is, Dutch doctors never took advantage of it. So Dutch people took advantage of it, and many other people take advantage of it because they go to retreats in the Netherlands. But the Dutch psychiatrists either failed to recognise the opportunity, or I think actively avoided it, and I don't know why. No Dutch doctors in the room. It's sad because they could have actually done a lot of the pioneering work on psilocybin using the truffles. And of course now we've got several Latin American countries have legalised all indigenous plants and plant products, which kind of seems to me intuitively sense. If something grows in the ground, native in your land, why shouldn't you be allowed to pick it and use it? Other breakthroughs, of course, were Portugal, decriminalising personal possession of all drug use back in 2005. Transformational approach. Actually reduced heroin deaths or opiate deaths by 2/3 in 15 years. And in comparison in the UK, where we carried on our prohibition policies, we increased deaths by 2/3 in the same time. And of course, America did a lot better. You've tripled or quadrupled opiate deaths. And now, of course, there are very interesting developments with with Denver and Ann Arbor and Oakland decriminalizing magic mushrooms, and Oregon. And that's, that is a fascinating decision. Let's just hope they do it right, that's all. Because if it went wrong, it could actually set us back. But currently, it's a very thrilling development. And it's obviously going to work because The Economist thinks it's a good thing. The Economist.